Here we're sewing the bodice and the bodice facing side seams. The side seams are these short ends right here. We've pinned the right sides together, and then we're going to sew at 3/8 of an inch. You can see here, after sewing, you're just pressing the side seams open. These seams will be enclosed, so no need to finish them. The next thing we need to do is determine which of our bodice pieces is the facing piece. The easiest way to do that is just to look at the side seam. The facings have 1 inch trimmed from the neckline, so you can see this top one is a little bit shorter. Also, the facing pieces don't have any notches around the bottom edge, so that's another way where you can tell the difference. If you are sewing the mini version, the kids version, the bodice pieces are the same. There isn't a separate pattern piece that's the bodice and the bodice facing. You'll just have to label them, and if you would like 1/8 of an inch trimmed from the neckline, now's the time to do it. You can do that on your own. You would do it all the way around the neckline except for where the strap is inserted. So 1/8 of an inch trimmed from here, and then around the neckline, and then again all the way around the back. Now that we determined that this is the bodice facing piece, we're going to stitch a fold guide at the hem. So that's just stitching a regular stitch line 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So there you go, there's your 1/4 of an inch stitch line at the hem. I find this really helpful when pressing. If you don't need that little fold line to help guide your pressing, you can skip the stitching step and just fold up the edge by 1/4 of an inch. Here you can see I've pressed the hem up at 1/4 of an inch using that stitch line as a guide. Alternatively, you can use an overlock or a zigzag to just finish your hem. So these are your two options. Now that we've done this, you can set them aside, and we are going to work on adding the straps to the bodice. Now we are ready to base stitch the straps to the bodice. I've pinned them to the front. Your base stitching, if you don't know that the strap length works for you, I've made this pattern a bunch of times, so I don't need a base stitch. Base stitching is just a longer stitch length so that if you need to remove them, it's faster. So I'm going to go ahead and use a regular stitch length and stitch at 1/4 of an inch. Now that we've attached the straps to the front bodice, we're going to make sure the straps aren't twisted and pin them between the double notches at the back. Again, you'll see your seam of your strap facing up. And you'll either base stitch these if you're not sure about the strap length, or you will go ahead and stitch with a regular stitch length at 1/4 of an inch. So now that you've attached your straps, you're going to want to try on your bodice and just double check the length. Like I mentioned, if you'll make any adjustments, and then once they're good, you're going to go back and stitch across using a regular stitch length if you have basted. Now we're ready to sew the bodice facing, this one with the folded edge, to the bodice. I've moved my straps out of the way, they're down. And with right sides together, I've pinned the top edge of the neckline all the way around. So we're gonna go and sew at 3/8 of an inch. I like to have the bodice facing up so I can see where I previously stitched the straps on. So that was at 1/4 of an inch, and we're gonna sew at 3/8 of an inch, and it will give an additional second line of stitching, added support where there's tension on the straps. Feel free to go slow around the corners. When I get to the strap corner, I'm kind of feeling for where the strap is, and I pivot right at the corner where it's attached. After stitching the neckline, I always like to check the straps to make sure the corners look nice and clean. So these look pretty good. And then we're ready to clip the neckline or trim it. My preference is to trim it to 1/8 of an inch. I feel like sometimes when you clip, you can clip too far and the seam gets a little weak. The only thing I would recommend to watch is when you're trimming to 1/8 that you're still including the previous stitch line that you did across the straps. Now that we've trimmed the neckline seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch, we're going to open up our bodice and finger press the seam allowance towards the facing, that's the side with the edge folded up, and we're going to understitch the neckline. So you won't be able to go all the way around the neckline, the corners will prevent that, but you can do most of it around the neckline. You'll skip the straps and then you'll be able to go all the way around the back. So again, we are opening and pressing the seam allowance towards, it's my right, which is where the facing is. And I like to kind of pull apart the seam just a tiny bit to make sure it's nice and flat. That's about as far as I can go on the front neckline. I'm going to skip the strap and continue around the back. After you've turned your bodice right side out and given it a press, your bodice is ready to be set aside. It's all finished. If you are sewing the child's version, you will need to insert elastic at the center back neckline, but I'll show you that in a separate video.